Fairly often, I get asked questions about how I got started podcasting with the Breaking Math podcast, and I'll often be asked this question by those who are thinking of starting their own podcast. That is, people who are looking to tell a story or share their unique wisdom with a larger audience or their passions, or maybe just advertise their business or services. I usually like to start this conversation by either showing off or telling about our preferred podcasting platform, Zencaster. Zencaster is essentially an all-in-one podcast hosting platform. On this platform, you can do everything from recording your episodes to editing your audio and video files to distributing your podcast to all podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever else podcasts are played. Now, there's more. When I first began podcasting, I used to get very nervous about how I would sound. I would sometimes stutter or have awkward pauses or other audio blemishes in my recordings. Now, Zencaster has a new suite of AI tools in their post-production process that make you sound really smooth. They automatically take out any of the ums or ahs in your recording. Also, they automatically take out any of the awkward pauses in your discussions. The tools will also help you set the right loudness and balance all the levels while reducing any background noise, all with the click of a button. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? You really should check it out. Really, the world needs to hear what you have to say. In fact, I'm going to give you a code below to help give you a large discount. It's all one word, Breaking Math. Go to zencaster.com/pricing and use my code Breaking Math, and you'll get 30% off of your first month in any Zencaster paid plan. I want you to have the same easy experience I do for all my podcasting content needs. It's time to share your.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Gödel, Escher, Bach is a book about everything from formal logic to the intricacies underlying the mechanisms of reasoning. For that reason, we've decided to make a tribute episode, specifically about Chapter 4. There's a Sanskrit word, Maya, which describes the difference between a symbol and that which it symbolizes. This episode is going to be all about the math of Maya. So what is a string? How are formal systems useful? And why did we study them with such vigor? All of this and more on this episode of Breaking Math. Episode 22, Incomplet. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Gabriel.
And today, obviously, we're going to be talking about a chapter of Gödel, Escher, Bach. And it's a great book. It's one of my favorite books. I remember reading it for the first time in college.
Actually, I do want to say, for the record, when we were planning out this podcast about a year ago right now, this was one of the books that came up. This was one of the books that you said we definitely want to talk about. So I am particularly excited that we get to talk about Gödel, Escher, Bach on this one. What were some of the other books that we had mentioned? I think one of them was a book called Zero, The Biography of a Dangerous Idea by Charles Sheaf. That's a great one. What else?
I Am a Strange Loop, I think we've mentioned at one point or
also
another.
By the same author.
Yeah, Douglas Hofstadter.
Yeah, absolutely. So.
Who, trivia time, the character in Big Bang Theory is actually named after him, which makes, I don't want to go into the politics of what that means, but there you go.
Very nice, very nice.
But yeah, it's a tome. It's like 737 pages, but it won a Pulitzer Prize. And it goes into like information theory, DNA, formal systems, neurology, self-reference, the nature of meaning, obviously mathematics, and very deeply into philosophy, but not in a way that's not rigorous, and that's why I like it.
Yeah, and actually, obviously, it's rooted in mathematics. What I also love about this, and you kind of alluded to this, is that the title itself, Gödel, Escher, Bach, is a mathematician, a musician, and an artist, and bringing those three together is just... it's beautiful is what it is. It's philosophical. It's deep.
And they all have one thing in common, and that is self-referential systems. Gödel, we'll talk about his stuff later, and it's all self-referential. We've talked about it in the past, on several episodes, actually. Escher, he has a lot of self-reference and a lot of meaning changes. For example, there's the famous waterfall painting where water seems to flow down and then all of a sudden go up again, or people infinitely descending a staircase, things like that. And Bach wrote canons. Yeah, we could play an example of a canon right here. And if you were astute, what you just noticed there was that all the voices were playing the same thing, but some of them were slower, some of them were upside down, some of them were backwards, and it takes a lot of effort to compose a canon. So that's kind of the essence of the book.
I have a few younger listeners who I'm actually going to recommend this podcast to. And for our younger listeners who may not be familiar with what exactly self-reference means, how would you explain it to somebody in 8th grade?
The word I.
It's something that refers to oneself.
Yeah, you could even do like a group of something. So example, I happen to be male, so I could say, all males eat macaroni and cheese. And I'm making a statement about myself, about other people too, but about myself.
Now, would this be a good example? So if you have a book, a dictionary, and the dictionary, of course, has all the words in the English language, or most of them, the word dictionary within the actual dictionary?
Yeah, that's a form of self-reference. Mm-hmm. It's not a strange loop because you can't keep going down and then end up where you started, like go infinitely descending a staircase.
Okay.
But it is absolutely self-reference.
So that's another key thing, is not only self-reference itself, but also the other idea of strange loops. And you had mentioned it's something that can keep going and going, kind of like a fractal, right?
Oh yeah, like you just keep going and you end up started at. Okay. So
holding up two mirrors together, is that an example?
That's a little bit of an example. Let's see. Another example might be something like it's difficult to come up with examples that are strange loops. I mean, Hofstadter argues in I Am a Strange Loop that consciousness itself is a strange loop. So it's not going to be something that I don't think we could go into too much into this podcast.
Okay, sure.
But what we are going to be going into is all the things that we mentioned above. Self-reference, the nature of chapter 4 of this book, which happens to deal with axioms and isomorphisms. And I hope you enjoy this episode. In this episode, we will be delving into concepts which Hofstadter explores in Gödel, Escher, Bach, chapter 4.
These include paradox, self-reference, and even Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
And we're going to be talking a little bit about formal systems and axioms, and we even have a dialogue for you directly borrowed from the book.
We hope you enjoy this episode.
So basically, back a long time ago, there was an isle called Crete. I guess it still exists. But there's this dude, Epimenides, from Crete, and he said a famous statement, all Cretans are liars. Now, is that statement true or false?
That is a wonderful philosophical conundrum, and actually I ran across that when I was in middle school, and that's the first time I was exposed to paradoxes like that. So let's break this down. If you say all Cretans are false...
and you are Cretan.
Okay, and you are Cretan, that's a very important point. If it's true, then what you just said is false.
Which then makes it true again. It flip-flops.
Yeah.
What this is a statement that is not a valid theorem in, I guess, just general common reasoning.
Yes, it's very trippy. You try to pin it down and it just doesn't work. I mean, we can talk about this statement. And what's funny is when we talk about the universe, when we talk about physics and math, we have statements that describe the world around us. But this statement itself, as Jonathan just said, it just doesn't work. So how do we describe statements like these? And how do you describe to somebody why they just don't work?
That itself is a problem that's been debated and is still debated. But the core of it is that it's something that's, I guess, neither true nor false, or in other words, it's not reachable. You can't start with a bunch of valid assumptions and then end up using logic with the statement, all Cretans are liars. It's impossible to reach.
It's the logical version of going cross-eyed.
Yeah. But what we're trying to do is figure out a math version of this.
The purpose of this segment is to introduce Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It might help to talk a little bit about what was going on in the world of math right before Gödel published his theorem.
Oh yeah, Hilbert was trying to develop what he called I think the math game or something like that, where you start out with one proposition and it branch out and somehow reach every provable and true. So I guess just every true theorem from this starting position. And there's actually a book by Whitehead and Russell called Principia Mathematica, which attempted to form a basis for all math, and Gödel just shattered it.
Yeah, it was basically the ultimate mathematical tome. It would have everything. It'd be the ultimate all-encompassing book about mathematics. And the reason why Gödel came and ruined it, how do we describe it? Gödel essentially proved that mathematics, or rather any system of logic, will always be incomplete.
If it's consistent and if it's sufficiently powerful, which we will see.
So basically, what Gödel said was that if you have any system that is consistent, in other words, it follows a set of rules, and it is self-referential,
or
it can be self-referential, then it'll always be incomplete.
Or vice versa.
Yeah. Or if you've got a self-referential system that is apparently complete, it will be inconsistent.
Basically, what that means is that you either have a system where everything that's a theorem in that system is true, but not everything that is true is a theorem. So we'll give an example of this later. Or you have a system where everything that is true is a theorem, but not every theorem is true.
And one of the other things that can be said about this theorem is essentially it proved that at its foundation, mathematics will always rely on a set of axioms, or rather statements that can't be proven to be true. Those are just simple axioms. And a lot of people find this deeply troubling.
Yeah, because some people aspire towards, for lack of a better term, godhood when it comes to mathematics. So we keep using this term theorem. What is a theorem?
Theorem. Okay, so I'm just going to give you an off-the-cuff answer to your question. A theorem is a statement that is true about mathematics, and that is my off-the-cuff definition.
See, that's almost on the money, but there's a very big difference between truth and theoremhood.
Okay,
a theorem is any statement about mathematics.
I'm going to play catch-up here real quick. A theorem is any statement that is true about mathematics?
No, any statement about mathematics. For example, the statement, all numbers are equal to 3 is a theorem.
Okay, got it. So
it's a false theorem.
Okay, so a theorem can be true or false, and truth is a theorem that is true. How do you define what truth is without using the word true?
You really can't. That's about the interpretation of the system.
So that's self-referential almost.
Truth has to do with meaning. Theorems have to do with formal systems. And by formal system, we don't mean I've made this joke before, a system with a tuxedo. But what we mean is a system where you have certain forms, like shapes, that, for example, the shape that looks like the number 2. Basically, everything that you've learned in math, those can be considered symbols. And any theorem can be represented as a string of symbols. So let me give you an example of a string that's not a theorem. Plus 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 equals plus plus. That doesn't mean anything.
Okay, got it. Well, so in my mind here, I just imagined, like a little baby philosopher or a toddler philosopher asking his mom, "Mommy, what is truth?" And then an answer, and I was seeing how a mom would answer that question. I mean, that is a legitimate philosophical question, and I admire your answer. So truth is kind of what is?
Yeah, truth is what is with respect to a certain system. So let me give you an example. With the whole numbers, 7 divided by 4 is equal to a number is false, because you cannot divide 7 by 4 with the whole numbers. With the real numbers, or even the rational numbers, it's 7/4.
Okay, so truth can also be consistency within a given system.
Truth is very closely related to consistency within any given system.
But it's not quite. This is a bugger of a definition.
Oh, yeah. So I know all of you guys just love definitions, and here's another one. Isomorphism. What is an isomorphism?
Let me take a whack at this real quick here. Isomorphism. Okay, let's break it down. So I know my Latin. So morph is change. Ism is thing. Change thing. ISO, as in I'll give up. Tell me.
ISO is actually means same, and morph means shape or form.
Okay.
So an isomorphism is a transformation that you can do from one thing to another that preserves all of the original information.
Okay, this is a really, really cool thing. And actually, during the planning of this episode, we talked about this a lot. And I love the concept of isomorphisms. We even have an entire list of examples here. Jonathan, what was one of your favorite examples of an isomorphism?
Well, I'm sure you've all made a cube out of construction paper at some point in elementary school.
Yep.
And so if you take a die, the surface of a die, or any cube really, I don't want you to think about the dots on the die, that is isomorphic to the unfolded piece of paper, because you could transform it into another. So any dot on the cube can turn into a dot on this unfolded piece of paper.
So in this case, the isomorphism is, as you just said, a cube, or what it would look like when you unfold it in 2 dimensions. You've got a 3-dimensional version of the shape, and you've got a 2-dimensional version of the shape, and it has the same information in both of them.
Yeah, and the isomorphism itself is the transformation. And another isomorphism is between this MP3 file that you're listening to and the meaning that we're imbuing.
Yes, now that gets a little more philosophical. I want to backtrack really quickly just because, as you had said, cube and paper, I thought of any origami shape. When you take any origami shape and you unfold it, and you can see all of the lines that went into the shape. That's essentially the 2-dimensional version of the origami shape.
Yeah, and any origami figure is isomorphic to a square piece of paper. That's a great example.
Yeah, so the meaning, would you say the meaning is preserved in an origami, let's say a crane, and then you unfold it and it's a paper and you've got the same creases, the meaning is still there.
The meaning is more about what's on top of what's being transformed. Okay. So like if I draw a heart on a swan that's been folded from a piece of paper and I unfold it, the heart is going to be somewhere on that piece of paper. So the heart didn't get lost. However, if we use scissors, we might cut off a piece of that heart, and it's no longer an isomorphism if we cut off pieces.
So that's the basic idea of an isomorphism. Now, as you had alluded to earlier, let's talk about a little bit of a deeper meaning. You had said one other isomorphism is this MP3 itself and the meaning behind it.
Yeah, this podcast that you're listening to and the bits and bytes that are creating sound waves to your ear. So there's several isomorphisms there, actually. There's the isomorphism between the sound waves that I'm experiencing right now and signals in the computer. Then there's an isomorphism between... actually, it's not really an isomorphism because there's compression, but just bear with me. An isomorphism between that and the file we save it as. And then there's an isomorphism between that and what goes into your ear, and an isomorphism between what goes into your ear and what is understood with respect to English.
Okay. So basically, yeah, as you just said, there's a whole lot right there. And the underlying theme here, the underlying thing is the preservation of meaning. So when you talk about, just to go on the same thread of thought that you started, when you talk about an isomorphism between the lines and shape that comprise the letters of the alphabet and the meaning in a sentence, that's also an isomorphism.
Cool. So do you think we have isomorphisms down?
I am comfortable with isomorphism. I love that word and I love the concept.
Sweet. So now we're going to talk about axiomatic systems.
Okay.
And we're going to introduce a symbol one. Every axiomatic system has symbols, and this one has 3 symbols that we're going to care about.
Yeah. We appreciate you guys hanging in there with us. These are meaty, rich topics, and they are so important for the theme of this episode as well as the book itself. So hang in there. This is some great discussion.
So this is a system with one axiom, plus equals. And that has a meaning, 0 plus 0 equals 0. Or it can have that meaning. It could have other meanings too. But if we interpret sequences of dots, so if we interpret ... as 3, then a theorem in the system might be ... plus ... equals ... meaning 2 plus 3 equals 5.
So basically what we're doing here is if previously we were defining terms like isomorphism, now we are defining rules that describe relationships in this system.
Well, all we're doing right now is defining the axiom plus equals, and the rules themselves are more to do with the human brain than they are with anything, because math doesn't care about what we think of it. This is just that, and actually just plus equals being an axiom doesn't mean anything yet. It's the rules of inference that we're going to introduce right now that make it addition. So let's say that x, y, and z are sequences of dots. So x might be ... y might be ... and z would obviously be 5 dots. If x plus y equals z is a theorem, then we have two rules of inference. Either x dot plus y equals z dot, or x plus y dot equals z dot. Both are true. So what does that mean?
So that's obviously describing relationships here.
So it means like if x is 2 dots, y is 3 dots, and z is 5 dots, then we know that 2 plus 3 equals 5, right?
Yes.
But if we know 2 plus 3 equals 5, we also know that 3 plus 3 equals 6, and 2 plus 4 equals 6. In fact, with these two rules of inference and the axiom plus equals, any sum of whole positive numbers can be demonstrated through the system. It can be proven that like 7 plus 14 equals 21.
This next section, we're going to talk about axioms and what they are and why they're important.
Now, since we're doing this about the Gödel, Escher, Bach chapter, I think that it would be appropriate for us to read a passage from the book. So in Gödel, Escher, Bach, he has a lot of dialogues. He considers himself a little bit of a dialogician. He always has the two characters, Achilles and the tortoise. And he actually got those from a Lewis Carroll dialogue that was used to demonstrate a logical fallacy.
How many of these little stories are there in Gödel, Escher, Bach?
Oh, there's one for every single chapter.
Awesome. I love it. So it's a book that is a very deep book about a math concept as well as art and meaning, and he starts everything with a lovely little narrative. So this is almost a first for Breaking Math. We've never really read a story aloud, have we?
No, but just because of the nature of these dialogues, I think it'd be wonderful to expose our listeners to just one of them.
Oh, definitely. Now, this particular story, there's a definite reason why we are reading this story. Should we explain to our listeners what they should look for in this story?
Well, what you should look for is a second layer of hidden meaning. Like, we're going to go explicitly into what the hidden layers are. But when a noun or any object appears in one of these stories, it tends to be a mathematical object, and it's kind of up to the reader to know what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give you a quick preview, this story is about a phonograph, a record player, and it's also about perfection. And it asks the question, is it possible to have any sort of perfect phonograph? Without further ado, let's say we jump in.
In this little radio opera, I'm going to be Achilles.
And I will be the tortoise.
Oh, and one interesting note before we start. In translations of the book, the tortoise is a female character because he wanted to unbias himself against inherent sexism.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so without further ado. Heavens, you certainly have an admirable boomerang collection.
No better than any other tortoise. And now, would you like to step into the parlor?
Fine. I see that you have a large collection of records. What sort of music do you enjoy?
Sebastian Bach isn't so bad, in my opinion, but these days, I must say, I'm developing more and more of an interest in a rather specialized sort of music.
Tell me, what kind of music is that?
A type of music which you are most unlikely to have heard of. I call it music to break a phonograph by.
Did you say music to break a phonograph by? That's a curious concept. I can just see you, sledgehammer in hand, whacking on phonograph after another to pieces, to the strains of Beethoven's heroic masterpiece, Wellington's Victory.
That's not quite what this music is about. However, you might find its true nature just as intriguing. Perhaps I should give you a brief description of it?
Exactly what I was thinking.
Relatively few people are acquainted with it. It all began when my friend, the Crab, have you met him by the way, paid me a visit.
'Twould be a pleasure to make his acquaintance. Though I'm sure I've heard so much about him, I've never met him.
Sooner or later, I'll get the two of you together. You would hit it off splendidly. Perhaps we could meet at random in the park one day.
Capital suggestion. I'll be looking forward to it. But weren't you going to tell me about your music to smash phonograph by?
Oh, yes. Well, you see, the Crab came over to visit one day. You must understand, he's always had a weakness for fancy gadgets, and at that time he was quite an aficionado for, of all things, record players. He had just bought his first record player, and being somewhat gullible, believed every word the salesman had told him about it. In particular, that it was capable of reproducing any and all sounds. In short, he was convinced that it was a perfect phonograph.
Naturally, I suppose you disagreed.
True, but he would hear nothing of my arguments. He staunchly maintained that any sound was reproducible on his machine. Since I couldn't convince him of the contrary, I left it at that. But not long after that, I returned the visit, taking with me a record of a song which I myself had composed. The song was called I Cannot Be Played on Record Player 1.
Rather unusual. Was it a present for the crab?
Absolutely. I suggested that we listen to it on his new phonograph, and he was very glad to oblige me. So he put it on. But unfortunately, after a few notes, the record player began vibrating rather severely, and then with a loud pop, broke into a large number of fairly small pieces, scattered all about the room. The record was utterly destroyed, also, needless to say.
Calamitous blow for the poor fellow, I'd say. What was the matter with his record player?
Really, there was nothing the matter, nothing at all. It simply couldn't reproduce the sounds on the record which I had brought him, because the sounds would make it vibrate and break.
Odd, isn't it? I mean, I thought it was a perfect phonograph. That's what the salesman had told him after all.
Surely, Achilles, you don't believe everything that salesmen tell you. Are you as naive as the crab was?
The crab was naiver by far. I know that salesmen are notorious prevaricators. I wasn't born yesterday.
In that case, maybe you can imagine that this particular salesman had somewhat exaggerated the quality of the crab's piece of equipment. Perhaps it was indeed less than perfect and could not reproduce every possible sound.
Perhaps that is an explanation. But there's no explanation for the amazing coincidence that your record had those very sounds on it.
Unless they got put there deliberately. You see, before returning the crab's visit, I went to the store where the crab had bought his machine, and I inquired as to the make. Having ascertained that, I sent off to the manufacturers for a description of its design. After receiving that by return mail, I analyzed the entire construction of the phonograph and discovered a certain set of sounds which, if they were produced anywhere in the vicinity, would set the device to shaking and eventually to falling apart.
Nasty fellow, you needn't spell out for me the last details, that you recorded those sounds yourself and offered the dastardly item as a gift.
Clever devil. You jumped ahead in the story, but that wasn't the end of the adventure by any means, for the crab did not believe that his record player was at fault. He was quite stubborn, so he went out and bought a new record player, this one even more expensive, and this time the salesman promised to give him double his money back in case the crab found a sound which it could not reproduce exactly. So the crab told me excitedly about his new model, and I promised to come over and see it.
Tell me if I'm wrong. I bet that before you did so, you once again wrote the manufacturer and composed and recorded a new song called I Cannot Be Played on Record Player 2, based on the construction on the new model.
Utterly brilliant deduction, Achilles. You've got quite the spirit.
So what happened this time?
As you might expect, precisely the same thing. The phonograph fell into innumerable pieces, and the record was shattered.
Consequently, the crab became convinced that there could be no such thing as a perfect record player.
Rather surprisingly, that's not quite what happened. He was sure that the next model would fit the bill, and having twice the money, he...
Oh, I have an idea. He could have easily outwitted you by obtaining a low-fidelity phonograph, one that was not capable of reproducing sounds which would destroy it. In that way, he would avoid your trick.
Surely, but that would defeat the original purpose, namely to have a phonograph which could reproduce any sound whatsoever, even its own self-breaking sound, which is of course impossible.
That's true. I see the dilemma now. If any record player, say record player X, is sufficiently high fidelity, then when it attempts to play the song I Cannot Be Played on Record Player X, it will create just those vibrations which will cause it to break, so it fails to be perfect. And yet, the only way to get around that trickery, namely for record player X to be of lower fidelity, even more directly ensures that it is not perfect. It seems that every record player is vulnerable to one or the other of these frailties, and hence all record players are defective.
I don't see why you call them defective. It's simply an inherent fact about record players that they can't do all you might wish them to be able to do. But if there's a defect anywhere, it's not in them, but in your expectations of what they should be able to do. And the crab was just full of such unrealistic expectations.
Compassion for the crab overwhelms me. High fidelity or low fidelity, he loses either way.
And so our little game went on like this for a few more rounds, and eventually our friend tried to become very smart. He got wind of a principle upon which I was basing my own records and decided to try to outfox me. He wrote to the phonograph makers and described a device of his own invention, which they built to specification. He called it Record Player Omega. It was considerably more sophisticated than an ordinary record player.
Let me guess how. Did it have no moving parts? Or was it made of cotton? Or...
Let me tell you instead. That will save some time. In the first place, Record Player Omega incorporated a television camera whose purpose it was to scan any record before playing it. This camera was hooked up to a small built-in computer which would determine exactly the nature of the sounds by looking at the groove patterns.
Yeah, so far so good. But what could Record Player Omega do with this information?
By elaborate calculations, its little computer figured out what effects the sounds would have upon the phonograph. If it deduced that the sounds were such that they could cause the machine in its present configuration to break, then it did something very clever. Old Omega contained a device which would disassemble large parts of its phonograph subunit and rebuild them in new ways so that it could, in effect, change its own structure. If the sounds were dangerous, a new configuration was chosen, one to which the sounds would pose no threat. And this new configuration would then be built by the rebuilding subunit under direction of the little computer. Only after this rebuilding operation would record player Omega attempt to play the record.
Aha! That must have spelled the end of your tricks. I bet you were a little disappointed.
Curious that you would think so. I don't suppose you know Gödel's incompleteness theorem backwards and forwards, do you?
Knows whose theorem backwards and forwards? I never heard of anything that sounds like that. I'm sure it's fascinating, but I'd rather hear more about music to break records by. It's an amusing little story. Actually, I guess I could fill in the end. Obviously, there's no point going on, and so you sheepishly admitted defeat, and that was that. Isn't that exactly it?
What? It's almost midnight. I'm afraid it's my bedtime. I'd love to talk some more, but really I'm growing quite sleepy.
And that's about half of the story. The rest of it is unnecessary for the purposes of what we're doing.
Can we say something along the lines of, don't take my word for, I can't finish that because it's copyrighted?
We could, because you are out of employment.
Yes.
But and the gist of it, and further on in the book, you learn that there are certain records for which the record player Omega cannot reconfigure itself to be able to play. So even with this amazing, complicated device, you still get unplayable records.
So by its nature, it is always incomplete.
Even though it could reproduce some sounds perfectly, it can't reproduce all sounds perfectly by the very nature of existing in a situation where, I guess in this analogy, the direct thing would be resonance. If you sing a certain note, a wine glass will break if you're in a cartoon.
Didn't we talk about that on the frequency episode, I think?
I believe we did.
Yeah, I'll check out that episode. It's a good one.
So in this story, Hofstadter points out some parallels that I'm sure that anybody studying mathematics would be able to deduce for themselves.
And for those who don't study mathematics formally, then we'll be happy to explain on this podcast.
Let's go term by term. A phonograph, what's a phonograph in this system? Actually, for our younger listeners, a phonograph is something that plays records. But what is a phonograph in the story?
So it's symbolic. A phonograph is symbolizing an axiomatic system for number theory.
The phonograph is the thing that turns things like 2 + 2 = 4 into 2 + 3 = 5. So the phonograph is kind of like the machine.
Yeah, it's got a set of rules, it's got functions, and following the axioms, you can have predictable outputs.
Yeah, and the sounds that a phonograph produces are true statements. So, and that's the gist of what the phonograph is, but there's several other parallels that we could draw as well.
Mm-hmm. I think later in the story, in fact, I think it was Achilles was suggesting that the tortoise, or rather that the crab, had pointed out that a low-fidelity phonograph would solve the riddle.
The low-fidelity phonograph is a weak, quote-unquote, weak axiomatic system, which is a system, you learn later in the book, that cannot refer back to itself even indirectly.
Okay. So again, the topic of self-reference is huge in this book. And then just for the purpose of this discussion, a weak system is a system that cannot refer to itself. And do we have any other examples to illustrate?
An example of a weak system would be the addition axioms that we had earlier. There's no way of reproducing rules of logic within that system. There's no formula, because as we'll see, even though you can turn any theorem into a number, you cannot manipulate that number in the way that the math it's not self-referential, is basically low fidelity.
Okay, very good.
And high fidelity is the opposite.
High fidelity is self-referential. Yes, and of course there's all kinds of math, especially in the realm of proofs with Gödel, that specifically address high fidelity, strong mathematical systems.
A strong system is required for complete number theory, really, because number theory, it includes statements like the prime numbers are innumerable. That's a statement of number theory. So number theory is basically everything that you think about math. So it almost has to be self-referential. Attempts were made up to 1931 to try to get rid of self-reference, in number theory, but then Gödel published his proof and dashed everyone's hopes.
Yeah, for eternity. That's probably one of the most profound proofs of all time.
Oh yeah, it's a proof about paradox itself and the limits of reason.
Which brings us to our next topic. The crux of the story is how a perfect phonograph, quote unquote, would operate. And this, of course, stands for a complete system for number theory, which we said simply does not exist.
Yeah, so if a phonograph is a system for number theory, a perfect phonograph is a complete one that we just described. Mm-hmm. And when the tortoise wrote to the manufacturers for the blueprint, those just are the axioms and rules of the system. So the building blocks, basically.
Mm-hmm. There's quite a few quite a few parallels here. There's also a record in the story is what?
A string. And by string, we mean something that you write down. It's the difference between a number and a numeral, basically. A numeral can be part of a string, but a number would be part of a theorem. Mm-hmm. So a string is just a way of representing theorems. So the grooves on the record basically represent, a something that can be interpreted. And if it's playable at all, then it's a theorem.
Okay. And if it's unplayable, of course, that would be a non-theorem. And then, of course, that gets into sound itself. A sound from the phonograph would be a true statement of number theory.
Yeah, and I would like to say that a non-theorem is not the same as a non-truth. A non-theorem is with respect to the phonograph itself. So a non-theorem means something that can't be derived from axioms, basically. You can't logically start with a series of assumptions and arrive at this, even though it may be perfectly true. And there are examples of true statements in number theory that cannot be derived using, for example, piano or arithmetic, which we covered on the episode about day-to-day math, hit tune of the hickory stick.
In fact, there's even one more here that we highlighted in this section. The statement, I cannot be played on record player X. That's the title of this song. And what parallel does that have in the real world?
I cannot be derived in formal system X. So that's the crux of it. That's just the title of the record, and that's just in the same way that the second one isn't really a mathematical formulation, but it's a way of, well, it is a mathematical formulation, but it's a direct parallel. So hopefully we beat this analogy to death.
Yeah. After we're going through it, of course, Hofstadter chose this analogy of a record player, but I think there are countless analogies you could do. Any device that has a specific output, you could do. Maybe for a writing exercise, one could think of another analogy other than record players to explain this concept with.
In fact, and don't Google this before you do it, but there is a proof of Gödel's theorem that could be done with the analogy of a fax machine. We're not going to give you that answer because you'll pat yourself on the back so much when you discover that. And like the tortoise said, this is only disappointing if you have unrealistic expectations of formal systems. It doesn't destroy reality. It's not a crisis. It just means that not every formal system can do all of math, and we're going to have to always improve on our formal systems.
It's almost like the game kind of never ends,
Yeah, which I think is, there's no, I'm going to wax philosophical for a second, there's no real point to life. And what meaning we derive from life is derived from the activities that we do within it. And if mathematics can be beautiful, then knowing that this beauty will never run out, to me, is actually a better result than if we had some machine that can derive all of math for us.
Is this at all related to the P equals NP?
P equals NP problem?
Yes.
It might have some isomorphisms, but none that I'm aware of.
I like how you use that word. That's the word of the day. Also, it's worth pointing, when you said that life has no meaning, it's not that it's meaningless, it's that it's like one specific meaning.
That's what I mean. Yeah, life has there's no one lens through which you can view all of life. And in the same way that there's no one axiomatic system that you can view all of mathematics. If you're enjoying this episode and love studying not only paradoxes, but the mechanisms behind them, you're going to want to be comfortable with logic. And if you're not 100% confident, then I'd like to point you towards brilliant.org. Their course on logic makes it fun and easy for you to start thinking logically and manipulating complex propositions. It's part of every form of math. Why not work through the course in just a few days? In particular, the chapter Syllogism and Sets has a lot to do with the concepts that we go into in this episode. So if you're at a computer, go to brilliant.org/breakingmath, click on their courses, select logic, and select the last chapter, Syllogism and Sets. That's brilliant.org/breakingmath. Not only are you directly supporting the show, but the first 200 Breaking Math listeners will get 20% off of the annual subscription that we've been using. And now, back to the show. So now we're going to go visit our old friend Euclid again, who, as you may recall from an earlier episode, was one of the founders of rigorous mathematics and developed one of the first, or the first, I'm not totally sure about that, systems of axioms. And even though it's criticized today for not being very rigorous, assuming that the person knows what a point is and not being formal, it's still an axiomatic system. And it's a good example of one. And so we're going to give you the 5 postulates.
Now, I think we've touched on this in a previous episode. I don't recall which one it was, if it was one of our earlier...
I can't recall at this point. It might have been on the episode about proofs, QED prove it.
Perhaps, yeah.
And the point of this being that the 5th postulate is uglier than the other 4, and we'll run through them real quick just to show you why.
Yeah, and besides, it's always awesome to review Euclid. He's great. So even if we've already visited this before.
Oh yeah, the Elements is like a 1,000-page book that uses 5 assumptions. It's amazing.
Yeah. First postulate: a straight line segment can be drawn joining any 2 points.
So you could draw a line between 2 points.
No arguments there?
Nope. Any straight line segment can be extended indefinitely in a straight line. So if you have a pencil, you could, or a what do you call them, a laser pointer. The laser pointer extends the line that the laser pointer is.
Third one says, given any straight line segment, a circle can be drawn having the segment as a radius and one endpoint as the center. Meaning
that if you have like a pencil or something, you can hold the eraser against the paper and move the lead around and make a circle. Yep. It's pretty self-explanatory.
I've done that with string as well.
All right angles are congruent, and that just means that if 2 things happen to be right angles, then they're the same angle.
And then the ugly postulate, the 5th one. Here goes. If 2 lines are drawn which intersect a third in such a way that the sum of the inner angles on one side is less than 2 right angles, then the 2 lines inevitably must intersect each other on that side if extended far enough. Oh my goodness, that's like a kid who tells you a story that goes on and on and on.
Oh, yeah. And so to break that down, I mean, what it means is if 2 lines are not parallel, then they're going to intersect. And you tell that they're parallel by looking at the sum of the interior angles with a third line intersecting it. It's something that we can't really do without. The other ones we could tell you what they meant, but this third one really does require a diagram. And you could tell that Euclid didn't like it because for the first several things that he proves, he ignores it, and he ignores it whenever he possibly can. And people for hundreds and hundreds of years tried to prove it using the other 4 postulates.
And they have not proven it yet.
And in fact, it is unprovable because you get perfectly valid and consistent mathematics by eliminating or modifying it. Mm-hmm. And for example, Girolamo Saccheri, who lived from 1667 to 1733, did a bunch of math that involved trying to prove the 5th with the other 4. And he reached a proposition that he was like, okay, this is repugnant to the nature of the straight line. And then he's like, fine, Euclid is freed of every flaw. And he wrote a book called Euclid Freed of Every Flaw, or Euclidis ab omni novo vindicatus. Which has kind of a sense of being vindicated. It's a very aggressive title.
Sounds like quite a fan of Euclid.
Oh, yeah. I mean, who isn't?
Well, of course, he had some very significant findings, and there was a lot to this. It sort of opened the door to a whole new kind of mathematics.
Oh, yeah. For example, hyperbolic geometry and elliptical geometry. You might know from class that if you take a triangle and you snip off the ends of the triangle, so you snip off 3 little triangles from the triangle, and you put them together, you'll get a straight line. So the sum of the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees is the math way of saying that. But in hyperbolic geometry, it's less than 180 degrees.
Now, isn't that kind of the exact same thing as Euclid's fifth postulate? Because with a triangle, you have that, well, I guess not necessarily.
I believe with the other four, and with that assumption, you can derive the fifth postulate, but you have to have that assumption. So it's just like having a postulate itself, and it doesn't really help anything.
And actually, I realized in my head, no, I'm totally wrong, because also if you have two lines that are in fact parallel, if they're not parallel, you can. If they are parallel, then you can't make a triangle. So all that does is you start with lines that are not parallel.
And J.H. Lambert tried doing this too, as did his father, and their correspondences are actually really funny. We don't have time to go into them, but they're very dramatic about wanting to prove the fifth postulate. And after a while, people were like, okay, fine, there's two new types of geometry, or 2 plus new types of geometry from this new thing. And to illustrate spherical or elliptical geometry, all you have to do is redefine things a little bit. You define a point as a pole and its antipole. So, for example, the North Pole and the South Pole on the Earth, or the United States and the Pacific, and the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So that is considered a point, which would normally be considered 2 points, but we're redefining what a point is. And then we redefine a line as the great circle, and a great circle is just a circle that has the same radius as the sphere. You could do all kinds of geometry with that. In fact, every single postulate, every single thing that Euclid proved that didn't require the fifth postulate works in hyperbolic and spherical geometry.
In fact, isn't there a Brilliant.org course on geometry that touches on this a bit?
So what you should take away from this, the discovery of 2 different types of mathematics from the modification of an axiom, is that axiomatic systems can have flaws in them, or not just flaws, but they could cover up beauty that you would not otherwise find.
Essentially, by changing an axiom, we discovered, or the gentleman who we mentioned,
Girolamo Saccheri.
Girolamo Saccheri. Excellent. I'm working on my pronunciation here. So basically, we learned that by changing an axiom, Girolamo Saccheri introduced us to a brand new form of geometry that wouldn't have otherwise existed.
Even though he didn't know he did it, and he didn't use it very much, because there's certain things that you can prove in elliptical and hyperbolic geometry that you can't prove in normal Euclidean geometry, if only he knew what he discovered.
The way you describe him, you describe him as somebody like holding a garage sale who's just selling an old pair of golf clubs for $20, even though they're worth like hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he just didn't really know it.
Yeah, and they belong to, I can't think of a famous golfer.
Golf clubs that belong to the original Euclid with all of his lines. He did all of his proofs on the golf course.
Euclid was an avid golfer.
Wouldn't that be awesome? Do a little cartoon of all of Euclid's proofs just with golf.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about consistency and completeness. A system that is consistent means that everything that's a theorem in that system, and a theorem, remember, is something that could be derived from axioms, is true. An example of this is Euclid. Everything that you can prove using Euclid's geometry is true. Something that you cannot prove using Euclid's geometry, though, is that a angle can be trisected, for example, which is something that you could do with paper folding, which is a different axiomatic system entirely. Consistency is with respect to the formal system. So let's say there's a biologically consistent system. Can you give an example of a theorem and a non-theorem not a non-theorem?
Biologically consistent system? Wow, okay.
So in a system that's consistent, like, for example, biologically, give an example of something that's a theorem that might as well be true or false, and in a theorem that cannot be derived in that system.
Oh, wow. Okay. So something that can be true or false but can't be derived from a system. Okay. Are we still doing biology here?
So consistency has to do with the subject matter involved. So let's say we had a formal system about biology. What's a theorem that could exist in biology? Maybe it doesn't have a true or false value, but it could exist.
Okay, sure. So without any true or false value, for instance, you could say that in a biologically consistent system, there could be a theorem whose interpretation is the statement, Shakespeare wrote an opera, but no theorem whose interpretation is the statement, cell less animals exist.
Yeah, and this is an example taken directly from Gödel, Escher, Bach. And another thing that he brings up in this thing has to do a little bit with consistency. Is all math the same? So like 1 plus 1 should always equal 2, right?
Yep.
And there should always be an infinite amount of primes, right?
Indeed.
And all right angles should be congruent, right?
Yes.
And postulate 5 should always be true, right?
Except for, as we just discussed, for those who are paying attention, should be, but really isn't.
So the question is, where is the line? And the answer is, we don't know yet. We're making leaps and bounds, but the art of axiomatic systems in the context of Gödel's theorem is only something like 87 years old.
Indeed. So to actually quote Rick Sanchez from Rick and Morty, he says, sometimes, Morty, science is more of an art than a science, and people don't realize that, except for in this case, it's mathematics.
It feels like that when you're talking about Gödel.
Yeah.
And then there's completeness. And completeness means that everything that is true is a theorem. Now, remember, consistency, everything that is a theorem is true, versus everything that is true is a theorem. There's a very subtle but very big distinction between these two.
In an incomplete system, what we're saying is that something could be true but could not be a theorem. And why could something be true but is not a theorem?
Because it could just be true within the assumptions of, like, for example, number theory. But it might not be a theorem because it might not be able to be derived from the basic assumptions. So, for example, it is true that 0 plus 5 equals 5, but if you use a number system which starts at 1, then you can never prove that because there's no 0, basically. That's a contrived and in many ways erroneous example, but that's the best one I could give. And an inconsistent system, remember, consistency, everything that is a theorem is true, means that some theorems are false, meaning that the system is basically worthless.
Yep. If you've got false theorems in there, that's a worthless system.
And I think that it bears talking about the fact that every system that can really refer to itself or that is sufficiently powerful has to have negation as a thing, or at least non-theorems. For example, P and not P is a famous example of something that's always false. So true and false is false, or false and true is false. But if we interpret the symbols differently, so for example, if we used the expression is for not, then P equals is P, it would be perfectly valid. So we have to have non-theorems as well, but that's a little bit more complicated.
So in essence, to sum that up, we've got completeness and we've got consistency. And so if a system is consistent, then it can never be complete. Is that right?
It's a sufficiently powerful system.
Okay.
A sufficiently powerful system can either be inconsistent and complete, or incomplete and consistent, or it could be just neither. But nobody studies those. I'm probably putting my foot in my mouth. There's probably people who study those. So now we're going to talk real quick about Gödel numbering. So remember the dots plus equals thing that we talked about earlier.
So real quick, just to give a little primer. So what can we expect with Gödel numbering? Why did Gödel decide to introduce a numbering named after himself?
Somebody else named it after him. But he...
That's at least less arrogant, the way I explained it.
But it's a way of turning theorems into numbers. Because, think about it, if we have a function that takes in a Gödel number and outputs the truth value of it, then that's a very powerful tool. So it allows number theory to make statements about itself. And all it requires is a very simple numbering scheme. Gödel's is more complicated than the one that we're going to be talking about. So let's say we have the theorem ... plus ... equals ...
That's not Morse code.
Nope, that corresponds to 3 plus 2 equals 5. Corresponds to not is. Big distinction. So if we let dot equal 1, plus equals 2, and equals be represented by 3, then we get this number 111,211,311,111 that represents a true theorem.
Now, does this bring us back to the term isomorphism that we were talking about earlier?
Absolutely, yeah. This is another isomorphism.
I don't know. I'm just on the ball with bringing it back.
So yeah, the Gödel function takes in theorems and outputs numbers. And the reason why we want to be able to do this is because you could think of this as quoting. So if we have a theorem, let's call it T, the Gödel number of T is like T in quotes. And if we took the Gödel number of that would be that even further in quotes.
Whoa, this is like Inception here. So the Gödel number of a Gödel number.
Yeah, you could keep doing that indefinitely.
Key in quotes, okay. So, all right.
And the reason why we want to be able to do this is because of a paradox that refers to itself without using the words I or this. And what is that paradox that we have mentioned on the show before?
Okay. Oh, this is a fun little paradox. All right. So, in quotations, preceded by its quotation yields falsehood, end quote. Preceded by its quotation yields falsehood.
So we have this little thing, preceded by its quotation yields falsehood. And that describes an operation. So the sentence refers to itself. And the sentence, like the eponymities paradox, is neither true nor false.
Yes. That's kind of the same thing as the Crete one, right? Where if you're from Crete, all Cretans are liars. Is that true or is that false?
The reason why this one's special is because it doesn't require any special self-referential symbols. It just requires quotation.
In a lot of sci-fi, isn't that how the heroes will defeat a super intelligent like supercomputer by asking if that statement is true or false?
Yeah, I mean you could defeat Google in the same way. You just Google when Googled breaks Google. No, you can't do that. I tried it, I failed.
When Google breaks Google. There should be some sort of self-referential Google search, can't there be?
That's an exercise for our listeners.
What happens when Google searches for itself? Has Google found itself?
Does Google know what Google is? Thank you, Google, for letting us reference you. Formal systems are the pillars upon which mathematics rest, but these pillars had to be constructed by someone or something, and whether or not that thing is truth is something that we've yet to find out. And the more we know about these pillars and the labyrinthine structures that were formed on top of them, the more that we'll know about how to construct mathematics in the future. We'd like to give a special thanks to Douglas Hofstadter for writing the chapter of the book that inspired this episode. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Gabriel.
And this has been Breaking Math. Now we're going to talk to you a little bit about an offer we have going on.
That's right. We have a Patreon account, which you can reach at www.patreon.com/breakingmath, and we have a few new goodies up there.
That's right. We have a poster that I worked very hard on that explains tensor mathematics, technically from start to finish. It's more of it's a review sheet, a very big review sheet. I believe it's 24 by 36 inches. But yeah, it'll introduce you to tensors, has some commonly used formulas on it. So if you're doing anything with general relativity or even certain types of engineering, you might want to get that. Or if you know anybody who is really into Einstein, this would be a perfect gift for them.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that it's a very unique poster because a lot of folks, this day and age, a lot of folks will study the mathematics of special relativity, but not a lot of people that I know are studying the mathematics of general relativity. So for that reason, this poster is a really great introduction to the topic.
Yeah, and I wrote this sort of as I was studying general relativity, and it contains everything that I wish that I would have been told directly.
Yeah. So it's an awesome thing that you made, and I'm sure that there's a lot of folks out there who would really appreciate your work.
And of course, we have other prizes on Patreon.com, such as Breaking Math Silver and Breaking Math Gold, where you could either get a shout out on the podcast, or you could have access to the outlines before the episodes are out. So if that's anything that you would like to do, or if that's something that you kind of want to do, but you really want to support us, we would absolutely love it. And it's just the price of a fancy cup of coffee.
We love your support and considering us. We have a lot of big plans for this channel. We'd love to have a YouTube show where we can show visuals. We also have a series of other educational podcasts, much in the same spirit of Breaking Math to do.
Not to give away too much information about our listenership, but we're reaching a point now where it makes sense for us to give you guys even more of what you already love.
Yeah. And it is, of course, our dream eventually to do this full time.
And if you want to help make that dream possible, poster time.
We are we'd be greatly appreciative of that. Which you can reach at www.patreon.com/breakingmath.